Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Global Education Program on commemorating World Day of Social Justice. This is part of our monthly webinar series, which offers students, teachers, and the public important information on timely global issues by having direct access to experts and to ask the questions that you want. If you're interested in learning more about our programs and to receive our weekly updates, please visit our website at worldaffairsdc.org. And just a quick note before we get into the actual presentation. After our speaker concludes his remarks, we'll just take a quick moment so that we can get all of the questions in. But if you want to use the chat function on the system, you can just chat in your questions. And if you can, please let us know your name and where you're writing in from. So February 20th is the official World Day of Social Justice, but we decided to celebrate it a little bit early, just hoping that we can start to stimulate some conversation around this topic. And the United Nations defines social justice as an underlying principle of peaceful and prosperous coexistence within and among nations. We advance this through removing barriers that people face because of gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, or disability. Now more than ever, it's important to continue to strive towards these goals as we face challenges across the globe and here at home. Our speaker today is David Smith, who is a leading authority on peace building, conflict resolution, and civic and global education. He has over 25 years of experience as a lawyer, mediator, college professor, and author. While at the U.S. Institute for Peace, his efforts resulted in the expansion of peace and conflict approaches in education, especially at the community college level. David has worked and consulted with nearly 150 colleges around the U.S. and has given over 400 talks on peace building, conflict resolution, and international education. I also have had the great privilege of working with David over the years in a number of capacities, including recruiting him to be a member of our Global Education Committee here at the Council. And I cannot speak highly enough of his work and really look forward to his presentation today. And so with that, I pass it on to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that. And it's an honor to speak to everyone this afternoon. I know in Washington we were dealing with a little bit of snow, a little bit. And if there are colleagues on the line who are from New England, we can't compare our snow to your snow, that's for sure. And so it's a nice sunny day today in Washington, but I think we're going to expect a little bit more snow this afternoon. So I'm really honored this afternoon to talk about social justice. And I've recently been doing a number of programs. I spent a lot of my time traveling around the United States, working with colleges, universities, high schools. I actually work a lot with community colleges. And actually, I'm going to kind of draw from some of those experiences this afternoon. I just got back last week from a week spending time visiting colleges in Tulsa, Bentonville, Arkansas, and Independence, Kansas, and 2 weeks ago visit colleges in Chicago. So one of the things that I'm really lucky is that not only do I get a view of what's going on in Washington, which inside the Beltway, which sometimes is a little bit myopic, I would say, it doesn't really give you the big sense of things, but I also spend a lot of time traveling around the United States and working with educators around the U.S. So my talk this afternoon is going to be very educator focused, though I'm glad students are on the line, and it's not going to be so esoteric that students can't participate and ask questions and get involved, and I really would love if they do that. So let's just kind of start off by talking a little bit about what we're going to cover. I'm not saying we're going to cover this in particular order, but first of all, the notion of what is social justice. I think that's something we can spend some time on, but social justice is not a definition that lends itself to precision. So we don't want to walk away with kind of a formulaic view of what social justice is. Talk a little bit about its philosophical roots, its historical applications. Why is there a need to emphasize today? So, why do we need to talk about social justice today? Talk a little bit about approaches to teaching, and then we'll have a good half an hour, hopefully, for Q&A at the end. So I always start off with this idea of, when you think of social justice, you think of. So I think this really gives us kind of the range of how people would interpret it. It's often easier to interpret it by a synonym than it is really by definition. So a lot of people would talk about racism as being, when they think about social justice. I think if you've been following, and I suppose we all have, the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, which I'll talk a little bit about also, people would say, well, social justice is treating people differently because of color or ethnicity, and that's an element of racism. Economic inequity or inequality, however you want to view it. That is people not having the same opportunities, we would say, or not having the same means to support themselves. When unemployment is high in one community and low in another community, people would say that that might be a lack of social justice. Human rights abuses, so particularly in the international context, and a lot of us are doing global education, when we think about social justice, we think about, well, where there's human rights abuses, there's a lack of social justice. So human rights crosses the spectrum. You could go to the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and look at some of those rights, and you see where they're not being fulfilled, you might argue, well, that's a lack of social justice. Discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, etc., all those kind of fall within it. And a lot of people, and certainly in the United States, we've been focusing on we've been looking at sexual orientation much more than we've done in the past. We're now looking at economic inequality much more than in the past. And all of these issues lend themselves to thinking about social justice. And the whole lack of access. A lot of what we talk about social justice in the United States, we're often talking about the inability to get to, the inability to access. So an inability to access healthcare. Now, we might not be able to get healthcare because it's inexpensive, or it's geographically inaccessible, or we can't access education because of its cost, or because of something that provides or presents a barrier to trying to access education. That may be viewed social justice. And certainly there are lots of other things that kind of fall within that. So social justice for people is very situational based, I would say also. It's very contextual. It comes from kind of your own situation as to how you might view it. There are words that we attach to social justice. You look at some of the words here, inequality or equality, theology. A lot of sociology is theology based. It can be ideological based, and you could come up with kind of different words that you would view in thinking about social justice. Of course, there are definitions, and there is a definition of social justice. I can't say that brings a lot of clarity, but justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. That doesn't give it much precision, but it does give you a sense of when we're looking at the issue of justice, we're looking at economics, we're looking at opportunities which cross the economic, employment, justice access, so forth, and privileges. And privilege is something we'll talk a little bit more about. Spending time looking at privilege, I think, is a really important aspect of getting students and young people to think about what social justice is about. Certainly, Martin Luther King has played a role in all this, and he's got some really great quotes. When I spend time with students, I like to pull quotes. King isn't the only one, but injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So you could say social injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So this idea that we are part of a global community, social injustice is not something that just happens in my little corner of the world. If it's happening in my little corner of the world, I want other people to know about it. And if it's happening in another corner of the world, we should be aware of it, and we should act as a result of that. As Amanda mentioned, February 20th is the World Day of Social Justice. This has been going on, I think, since about 2007. Social justice is really a word that's used a lot by the UN. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's used. It's been a notion that's really kind of been incorporated in a lot of the idea of the mission of the UN and the work that we should all be doing. So you can kind of go to that webpage. I actually recommend that you do that. There are some really interesting documents you can pull from and some other quotes and so forth. The International Labor Organization, which is noted there, also really works. It's been around for a long time, works a lot in making sure that there's labor equality, basically looking at labor issues. They've been really in the forefront of looking at social justice. So kind of looking at it in a historical and contemporary way, and we'll go through this pretty quickly, is that there's been, social justice has been looked at for a long time. It goes back to antiquity. And Socrates certainly talked about social justice. Often, at that time, they were talking about distributive justice. We're talking about wealth, in a sense, within a society and how to distribute it. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic theologian, really talked about it in terms of moral philosophy. So moving from this idea of purely an economic way of viewing it to something that was more in a way of morality. It was in the 19th century that Luigi Tapparelli, who was a Catholic theologian, he was a Jesuit priest, really started using the word social justice. And this is really going on in the early part of the 19th century. There was a revolutionary period that took place in Europe with revolutions taking place in France and other countries in Europe. And this idea, a lot of these revolutions were spurred on by the lack of opportunities, the lack of social mobility, a very structured caste system, not in the way we might view in a place like India, but certainly a system that was structured and that people couldn't move from one level to another. So this idea of social justice really came to meaning in that period of time, and he was actually one of the first people to actually use the word social justice. And so he was a Jesuit priest. So even today, within the Catholic Church, if you look at Jesuits are an order in the Catholic Church of priests. Many Jesuit institutions in the United States have social justice programs. Often they're tied to peace education or peace studies. So for instance, in Washington, D.C., Georgetown University has a very strong social justice focus. So today we look at it in terms of the distribution of wealth in the United States. Particularly, we've been looking at social justice in terms of the haves and the have-nots. Structural injustice, that is, the structures of society provide for injustice. When we look at structure, and this has actually been a particular issue in Ferguson, Missouri, for instance, is that we have injustice because of the way our education system is structured, or our political system is structured, or our justice system is structured. And these are not easy things to overcome. One of the challenges about creating social justice is overcoming things that are structured. So for instance, to give you an example, there's often inequity between school districts because often there's a proliferation of school districts. There are a lot more school districts than you need. This is one of the challenges in St. Louis County. So there are, I don't know, 26 or 27 school districts. I may have the number wrong. And so when you have many school districts, what you often have is a lot of variance in what the school district provides students because the school district is supported by a very small tax base. So if you have a small tax base and, the tax base are not affluent people, the education system that comes out of that is not going to be the same as a tax base that's very affluent. And often you see structures set up like school districts. It may not be intentional, but they look very different because of the economic base in which it's being supported. So you have kids who are graduating, they're coming from very different systems. I'll talk a little bit about Ferguson as basically an example of that in a minute. Closely tied to faith perspectives. So it's not only in Catholicism and Hinduism and Islam and Protestant faith perspectives, there's a lot of talk about social justice as being a moral obligation that people have. A liberation theology is a particular Catholic theology. It's actually being raised a lot lately because Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of San Salvador, was assassinated, I think, 20 years ago, and Pope Francis is now looking at the process of which he could become a saint, basically. And he was a proponent of liberation theology, which was basically arguing that within Catholic Christian, the work of Jesus was this need to create equality within society, and it was a sense of activism that people could take on, and it was very controversial within the Catholic Church in Latin America in the 1980s. Peace education, which is an area that I spent a lot of time on. Peace education is very broad, it's very globally oriented, but it talks a lot about empowering students with the ability to work across cultural differences, to use diplomacy and negotiation to bring about change, to take an activist role when necessary, to take a role in stewardship when it comes to the earth and looking out for each other, and to promote nonviolence. So that's often tied to social justice. And then human rights education. So there's a strong alignment between human rights, which are actually, they're often, actually very defined within the law, or sometimes they are, kind of accepted, kind of a natural rights, human rights in a sense, that often the espousing of human rights and advocacy for human rights is a means to social justice. So if human rights are protected, social justice is achieved. So today when we think about social justice and thinking a little bit more maybe about the United States, one of the issues is the whole discussion of the 1% versus the 99%. So sometimes the discussion of social justice evolves around economic differences and economic variances and gaps that continue to exist in the United States and actually are spreading. So, you know, the 1% of the country owns the wealth and the 99% don't. So how do you get that imbalance and kind of undo that imbalance, we would say? That process is a process of creating social justice. Access to education. And once again, access to education, there could be barriers that are economic or geographic or, you know, where people live. You know, there's some communities where there is not access to good schools. So it's just not a matter of being able to afford it. There are no schools in the area, or the schools are problematic for whatever reason. So this ability to have the opportunity of education in the United States, we've always argued that the way of mobility is through education. So the inability to access education then becomes the inability then to move up the economic and social ladder. That then becomes an issue of social justice. Access to technology, this is increasingly being kind of argued in social justice contexts. So today we've been talking about issues like net neutrality and open access to the internet and wireless access in communities and just internet access in communities. And people are now starting to talk about technology, and particularly in terms of the internet, as being a right. When something is a right and is denied, then we often argue it's social injustice, because it's something that there's an indistribution of these opportunities through technology. Access to health care is increasingly an issue about social justice in the United States. So because we have a health care system that requires people to pay for health insurance in order to access it, then you have the economic means to access health care. But it could also mean the unavailability of doctors or other healthcare practitioners in your community. So in some communities, it's not really a matter of whether you can afford it or not, as much as there are no doctors that you can go to. There's no one that you can access for healthcare. That would be a lack of social justice. And then access to justice. And particularly, one of the contexts is Ferguson, Missouri. I spent some time in Ferguson in August. I was invited to come out to Ferguson on behalf of St. Louis Community College, Florissant Valley. There are 4 campuses of St. Louis Community College. And one, the Florissant Valley campus, is actually in Ferguson, Missouri. So I was asked to come out because I work so much with community colleges and help the college think about moving forward and in a social justice context, what they could do with their students, what kind of education they should be provided. You know, one of the things about social justice is there's always a contradictory narrative. There's a narrative that says social justice is an issue. So the hands up, don't shoot, justice for Mike Brown is the narrative that there's a lack of justice. There's social injustice in our community. And the kind of I Love Ferguson narrative, which is a campaign that was sponsored by many of the longstanding members of Ferguson, a lot of the white community in particular, not really arguing that this is a social justice problem. This is a problem that may have to do with, you know, changes in our relationships with African Americans, but it isn't as deep as a problem that may be perceived. One of the things that I realized when I was in St. Louis visiting this college was that students have a real need to seek social justice. It wasn't just the black students, but the white students did really feel that something was amiss. St. Louis, like many communities, has a history of racism and inequality, and students felt that they needed to do something. And they often were arguing to me, nonviolent, dialogue-based approaches to trying to make differences. And I think some of those are underway in St. Louis. And if you're interested in St. Louis, these are conversations we can have offline, and I can share a little bit more about what's going on there. So one of the things to think about is that when social justice becomes injustice, we would say, when there's a lack of social justice, then this idea of an obligation to resist becomes a duty. So we can't talk about social justice as something that is an entitlement only, and maybe even not at all in some respects. We have to talk about it as an obligation, not only the society has for us, but also an obligation that we have, members of society, to act on our behalf and act on other people's behalves. So when we talk about social justice, we always need to frame it in terms of what people can do, and particularly what young people can do in their community. So a little bit about teaching social justice. So one of the things that I really think is important is this idea of experiencing social injustice. Because social justice in itself is often difficult to define, and it's, you know, it could vary in many different ways. Sometimes a nice strategy is to have students experience what social injustice is like. And I'm going to give you an example of what I did recently at a community college in Maryland. But in our own collective American history, and certainly in global history, there have been periods of social injustice and injustice taking place. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate, but it's just the reality, is that students today, particularly American students, haven't experienced social injustice. They've heard stories of it, they have read about it in history books, and they have their grandparents who can share it with them, but they haven't really experienced it. And one of the things that I think is valuable in teaching about social justice is using experiential education, creating opportunities for students to feel a little bit about what social injustice could be like. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Talk about the requirements of obligation, as I would say. These obligations that we have to our society to make a change and to look out for each other is very important. Talking about privilege, I think, is very much a part of social justice. So whenever there's social justice issues, when there's injustice, there is always a dominant group that is a privileged group that is suppressing, we would argue, another group. Often it's a minority that's suppressing a majority. So for instance, if you look at issues of social injustice around the world today, you can look in lots of countries around the world where there's an elite minority that has the reign of power, that have the economic privileges. They have the privilege. And then the minority under that is living, you know, in some sort of oppressive environment. If you look at the United States, for instance, if you look at the South of the United States, you just have to go back 40 or 50 years and recognize that in many parts of the South, the whites might have been the minority, or barely the majority, but maybe the minority, and they had the power over the blacks in a sense. And so you had black African Americans living in economically distressed parts of the community, being denied access to education, having to live under segregation laws that restricted where they go and where they eat and where they shop, and the privilege belonging to the white majority. What's really important about teaching social justice is for students to experience both being privileged and being oppressed. So often when you get students experience being oppressed, they're very upset about being oppressed. And they recognize that this is not fair and this is not what should be happening to them. On the other hand, when you have students with the opportunity to feel that they're privileged, they're not quickly aware that they're privileged. Some students take their privilege as kind of part of their reality, in a sense, as to be expected. But once they recognize that they're privileged, what I find students are quick to admit it and quick to recognize that their privilege is at someone else's expense. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. Examining issues in the community, both in the local and global context. So when we're thinking about social justice, we can talk about things that are farther removed in other parts of the world, and I think that is very useful, and I think that's what we do because we're global educators. But often for students to really grasp with it and find and recognize what is it they really can do, we have to kind of localize it and look at the local context of things in order to understand what we can be doing with regard to social justice. And then considering objectives, what are students trying to achieve? And more importantly that I find is getting students to develop an action plan. I really think it's important that whatever we do, we provide students with something they can take away. This will require students to recognize what their community looks like and to do something they can follow up with. So let me spend the last few minutes talking about something that I did at a community college recently in Maryland, and something that I think lends itself to any educational environment. Could be a community college, a high school, a middle school, a four-year institution. Anne Arundel Community College is near Annapolis. I live in Rockville, Maryland, and it's probably about an hour drive to the northeast in Maryland. It's a college of about 50,000 students. It's a large, comprehensive community college, probably 200 to 300 faculty, been around since the early 1960s. And I was asked back in October to participate in the launch of their Year of Social Justice. So what the college has done is the college has devised an interdisciplinary faculty and staff corps from many different fields. My wife incidentally teaches there, and she teaches nursing, and she's on this committee. Because social justice is not something that lends itself only to the social sciences, it works across many different fields. So this community has gotten together, the social justice community, and then has planned a series of events throughout the year with the hopes of integrating social justice themes throughout the college in many different ways. One of the ways that it's working here, for instance, is that in many colleges, especially community colleges, there are what are called learning communities created. That is, courses that are different from each other, where students are taking both courses as a cohort. So at Anne Arundel, they have a Introduction to Sociology course, which is part of the social justice learning community, and a Fundamentals of World Communication, which is it. So these students are meeting in both classes. Often these classes are meeting back to back, and they're dealing with social justice themes in terms of sociology and in terms of communication and seeing how they mix with each other. So this group has been sponsoring activities throughout the year. I think there's a culminating activity probably at the end of the year, but I was the kickoff, so I can tell you a little bit about how I approached it. So one of the ways that I've always viewed education, as I said before, is that getting students to experience something that's going on in a way that they might not expect it. So how I looked at my presentation, or viewed my presentation, is really as an opportunity to get students to understand what social injustice is about. So rather than getting up and talking about social justice, I actually set up a scenario where students actually arrived for the event. I had probably about 100 students, and the students were suddenly put in a situation where they basically were given one of two cards. They were even given, let me go back. They were even given a multicolored card, could be orange or blue or white. And there was a sign throughout the room, which is a large auditorium space, saying that those students with the white cards could sit in the front, and those students with the multicolored cards would need to stand in the back. And so I appeared as the chief of police, or the chief safety officer. I have a hat. I keep my hat with me. I wear my hat, if you like. And I basically show up, and I basically announce to them in roll that a new ordinance has been passed. And the ordinance requires all educational institutions and public meetings to maintain separate standing areas for multicolored cards and seating areas for white cards. So basically creating a segregational environment that might have existed, certainly did exist in many, many parts of the South and many parts of the rest of the country through the early 1960s for students who haven't experienced this. So students walk in and they get their cards and they have a seat. And then once they're seated or standing, a lot of them were standing, the ones that are standing and were noticeably uncomfortable about what was going on because there was clearly space to sit, but they weren't going to sit. And the students that were seated were kind of odd. We're not kind of understanding what was going on. So still in roll, I talk about the legal objectives for this new ordinance. We're trying to maintain order, cleanliness, prevent further unnecessary intermingling of the the multicolored card holders and the white card holders. This is a furthering educational efforts because this improves education. It's consistent with Judeo-Christian principles, meets the expectations of different groups, arguing that the white card holders and the multi-card holders like being separate from each other, and it's a codification of longstanding tradition. Now, these are actually the arguments, same arguments that were made in many parts of the country to justify segregation. So if you go back and read newspapers or speeches or whatever it was of the day, you would find arguments that look very much like this. So students, I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, and I have a short video. If we have a few minutes, I'll show parts of it. Students at first are kind of perplexed about what's going on. And then at a certain point, I ask the students who are standing in the back and sitting in the front if they understand that this is okay with them. And when I did this, at first there was kind of a bit of a silence for a few minutes. And then students in the back were kind of raising their hands. I actually at first didn't even acknowledge students in the back because these are second-class students. They are multicolored card holders. So I was really wanting to talk to the students in the front. So I actually forced the students in the back, and I didn't answer their questions. And I went to the students in the front, and I spent time with them, talking to them about how they felt about it. And first couple students said, well, it seems okay to me. And then students were starting to think, well, you know, there are plenty of seats up here. Why can't everyone sit together? And then eventually the students in the front kind of recognized they've got a bit of privilege here. So then I go to the students in the back, and the students in the back are very upset. And, you know, they're raising their hand, they're saying, why can't I have a seat? And then I had some older students in a community college of a range of students who, you know, are, you know, much older than younger students, maybe in their 50s or 60s. And some students were actually talking about what it was like living in segregation back in the 50s and 60s, and they went to different schools and they didn't like it. These are, you know, students of color for the most part. And some of the students were getting kind of emotional, upset about it. Not, you know, this is not what they want to experience again. So then I go to the students in the front who are sitting with the white cards, and I say, well, what should we do about it? And they said, well, they should come and sit here. So what I actually had the students do is I have all the students in the front get up and walk and go to a student who's standing and invite them to sit next to them. And I said, you know, part of change and transition is a process of reconciliation. Now, there's not much you can do in an hour time with students, but the mere physical effort of the privileged students having to get up, walk over to students not privileged, invite that student to sit down next to them, and if they wanted to apologize, they suggested you could even apologize for what's going on, could be a very valuable experience for them. Then what I had is I had the students then break down in groups and think about what an action plan could be. And not only did I have them think about what an action plan could be, I had them report it out and you know, something that they could do. And so students are collectively thinking about first what issues are of concern to them, then thinking about what they can do about these issues by myself and working with others. I then had students actually sign the white paper, the big sheets of paper, put their emails, and I said, now your obligation is you are now a group. In a sense, in terms of the scenario, they're an integrated group because some of them are multicolored card holders and some of them are white card holders, certainly. And what you can then do moving forward as a community and how you should do this. So getting them to think about what they can do as a group. So by the end, of course, I'm out of role. We're talking about this generally, but you know, one of the things that I find is you give students to experience a bit about what social justice is about, either from the standpoint of being the privileged or the unprivileged, we say the oppressed, then I think they can appreciate what social justice, injustice might be in other parts of the world, we'll say. So questions, I'll stop there, and what I'll do is I am going to stop sharing. I have a video that I could show, but you know what I'll do is I'll see what kind of questions are coming from everyone, and then if we have a few minutes, and I'll show a little bit of this video. So Amanda, I'll give it back to you then.
Okay, great. Well, so if everyone, I'll give you a chance to type in your questions. So while we're waiting for those, I'll just kind of throw the first question out there. And you know, one of the things that you know, working with or at least mostly high school educators, that we find is, you know, there's a bit of a fear of the unknown or the feeling unprepared to teach about these issues. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, as you know, an educator bringing this into the classroom, some advice on, because some of these issues, you know, especially when you're talking about, at least in this area, kids coming from very diverse backgrounds and a range of experiences. How do you talk about these issues in a way that's, you know, constructive, maybe somebody who's not as, you know, prepared.
Well, one of the things I would say is that when we're dealing with education, there are actually two parts of education. And one part I always find teachers are really good at, and that's the pedagogical approach. And pedagogy is, you know, how you go about teaching it is, I think, really strong suit with a lot of people. Where people feel often weakness is really having content. That is, you know, if they're posed a question about, well, what happened in our community in 1966? Can you tell me about that? That rarely happens as students ask those type of questions. But I think these are things that can be learned, and I don't think that it's necessary to teach, for instance, social justice from an historical standpoint. You can really teach about it in terms of what's going on in today's world, and those are things that I think are easy to kind of pick up and understand. So I do recognize that, but I do think that we can't get too fixated on getting the history right all the time. Because one of the things about history that I think we all recognize is that history is often, history is written by the victors, right, by the winners, and history is often very distorted. So if we focus on making sure we get the history right, sometimes we're not presenting the history as it should be. It's better to kind of think about it more contemporarily and think about how students can learn about these issues.
No, I think that's very important, and putting it into a context that they can understand and sort of grasp. So that being said, you know, you mentioned that you had gone to Ferguson, and so can you tell us a little bit more about that and how the students reacted? Because there's obviously a difference between sort of teaching about social justice or injustice in a broad sense and sort of getting an understanding of what it is, and it's another thing to sort of be in the midst of it.
Yeah, so one of the things to understand about, I think whenever we walk into a situation where we're an outsider, we have to first of all recognize we're an outsider, and that because we're somebody from the outside, we don't have the credibility, but we also have to be reasonable in what the expectations might be and what we're trying to accomplish. So my role there wasn't to teach social justice. It wasn't there to fix anything. It was really there to listen to students, to listen to faculty, to come up with a plan. So I take a very humble approach when I do this. One of the things about every community is that there's a certain demographics that reflect this community, and in St. Louis is very divided, white and black. North St. Louis is more African American, more people of color. South St. Louis is more white. And the community colleges are like that too. The community college that I was working with was predominantly African American because it's in Ferguson. My role out there was really to get students to talk about, one, how they feel and what is the expectation of what their community and the college should be doing for them. So I asked students to kind of raise, when I work with students, I often give them words and concepts to think about rather than going to students and saying, tell me how you feel. I give them some things to choose from. So I would give them a list of words, you know, how are you feeling, what do you want to get done, and so forth. And I found, for instance, the African American students found there was a lot of racism in the community. And I actually met with students who told me very graphic and heart-wrenching stories of situations they've been in. One of the challenges that I found, and I found this not in Ferguson, but dealing with kind of the other campuses that are predominantly white, is that we don't really sit down and have conversations with each other much anymore. And deep cross-racial, ethnic, cultural divides to learn each other's stories. And one of the things that the African-American students were sharing with me was the fact that the white people don't know my story. They don't know about who I am. We don't have those conversations. And what happens is at the college, in people's high schools, you know, the black students are here, the white students are here, the jocks are here, the cheerleaders are here, that kind of thing. And so people don't know their own story. So one of the things that I learned was the necessity, in order to break down barriers and promote social justice, we have to start by knowing each other's narrative and each other's story. So I would suggest as kind of a starting point for people to think about that. Are the conversations taking place?
Yeah, I think that's so important. A few years ago for our Leadership Academy, we had two panelists come. One was Palestinian, one was Israeli, and they were young people, and they were here on a program to work together and focus on peace building. But I was very surprised when they were explaining both of their perspectives and understanding that neither one of them really knew each other's history. They kept getting facts wrong, which of course immediately sort of course they were, trying to be peaceful, but you could tell it was sort of inciting them a little bit of, no, that's not really how it happened, so it was.
And the effort in peace education is to create a joint narrative, is that in Israel-Palestine you have very different narratives. I mean, when I was at USIP, we focused a lot on that part of the world, and then how do you find a narrative that we can all sign off on, that may be a bit of compromise, a bit of rethinking about history. If you have a joint narrative you can operate within, then you can kind of work forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple of questions here. So Tony Harris asks, when educating about or for social justice, you may run the risk of resurfacing injustices, related traumas for participants. What are some of the strategies for creating safe spaces for trauma and having heavy emotions and things like that?
So there are two things that I would say. One is know your students very well, and that is the better you know your students, the better you know what those danger spots may be, we would say. So for instance, when I deal with difficult issues with students, I teach at the graduate level, I've taught all levels, is that I make sure that I've developed a trust and rapport with my students, so the students know that there's a safe space, they can come to me. Students recognize that there's a way of behavior that's expected. That may not happen the first day of class.
Yeah.
If that can't be accomplished, then you often need to start off with kind of, we'll say, warnings or some statement to the extent of, I recognize that this may be difficult for people to deal with, and I recognize that people may have different views and that this may basically uncover some hurts, and I apologize in advance. And if people are uncomfortable with that, they should let me know. And maybe you say this to class before. I mean, I've taught situations where I teach a lot about violence, and because I teach a graduate course, and I tell students at the beginning of the semester, let me know what topics are difficult for you to deal with. Now, I've had students come up with me, and students said, well, I can't deal with this type of violence. I said, okay, then we will talk about this issue in a different context. So it's a combination, getting to know your students and kind of putting the warnings out there, creating a safe space they come and talk to you. That takes some work, obviously.
Yeah. I have a question here from John Peacock, who wants to know a little bit more about your program at Anne Arundel Community College. And he asks, what were some of the action plans that students came up with in your scenario that you created for them?
So I'm not at Anne Arundel Community College. I was brought in from the outside. But the students who develop action plans, most of them, first of all, were very local oriented. They're not global. Community college students are often more tied to the local community. What I found, a lot of students were actually focusing on economics. So a lot of students were focusing on jobs in their community and things that they might do to advance training, we would say, in their community, particularly to communities that were not reachable. So for instance, in many communities, there is kind of an invisible underclass, right? In the United States, for instance, we have a lot of Latino community, Latinos, who are kind of an invisible underclass. Often they may be undocumented. Often they may not be engaged in society. And so I remember students talking to me afterwards and saying, well, that's kind of an invisible class. These people are not getting trained. They're not in school. How do I reach out to them to encourage them to come and to take classes here? Because a lot of social justice are taking courses at a community college. So a lot of it is students, I felt students are trying to kind of realize, first of all, who is it in our community that may be in need, and what are the issues that they're dealing with?
Yeah, so one of the other questions was, kind of going on top of that is, obviously, you have students who come from very different backgrounds oftentimes and have had different experiences. So do you find that the dialogue becomes very different in those situations, or does everyone sort of get on the same page, or is every experience that you have extremely different based on the backgrounds of the students?
I would say, first of all, is that if a faculty member wants to set up, a teacher wants to set up a dialogue-based experience, that they have to think about what they're doing, and they have to be prepared for lots of different things. I think creating a dialogue opportunity takes some thoughtfulness and some preparation on behalf of the teacher. And take some expectation that students have. So, for instance, I think it's appropriate in a dialogue situation to basically say there are certain things, there's certain ways we will treat each other and there's certain ways we won't treat each other in this conversation. And there's certain ways that we will ask questions. Part of dialogue is distinguishing the difference between advocating to change somebody's point of view and having a conversation for purposes of getting somebody to understand your point of view. And it's the second that I think is more important.
Yes.
Often we view conversation as a matter of debate, trying to get people to think the way I am, and that creates defensiveness. Rather than the expectation in dialogue is for you just to understand what my experience is like and what I'm going through. If you set that kind of expectation, a lot of the bad side of dialogue relates to trying to clobber somebody over the head with your opinion to try to get them to convince them that they should be thinking the way. That's where you see the underbelly of it. But if what you're doing is you're creating an environment where what we're really just trying to accomplish is that I want you to understand my experience, you get students to think about active listening, how they can indicate, get students to maybe write a journal entry afterwards about what they learned from that other person, then I think it's successful.
Yeah. So then there was another question here, sort of kind of going along the lines of that, but have you ever gotten to a point where there was too much conflict that arose in the dialogue or sort of became at a standstill where students were no longer listening to each other?
Yeah, I've had situations like that, and I can't say that I've always been able to work them out well. One of the things that I do a lot of is getting students to do role plays. And I often try to get students to role play of individuals that are not anything like them and people that they might even be uncomfortable with. And I've had situations where I've had students role play as individuals that they absolutely will not do. I remember once many years ago, I did a program at Northern Virginia Community College, and I have a scenario where I have students play Israelis and Palestinians in a situation where they're trying to work out differences. And I had I think I had a Muslim student who was going to play an Israeli student, or an Arab. I don't know if she was Arab, or I mean, she might have been Muslim, I'm not sure, but I'm trying to remember back. She would absolutely not play that Israeli student under any circumstance. And I probably had the opposite, where I've had Jewish students who have not wanted to play Muslim students. And I did talk to her afterwards, and at the point in time when you're trying to work this in a larger group, sometimes you don't have the luxury of stopping, trying to understand the students, using it as a learning moment, right? Right,
yeah.
But I do think those things that happen, and part of maybe of when before you engage in these situations is get students to understand that they will be put in uncomfortable situations. Learning is best when students are slightly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If students are completely comfortable in their situation, learning is not optimized. But when students it's a little bit edgy and students have to kind of be really aware of what's going on, then they learn. So it's often necessary to do that, but I can't say it works well all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also important for students to know, I mean, that's just life as well. You're going to be uncomfortable sometimes and put in difficult situations, and it's important to learn how to think through those things. That's really important. So then there's another question here about sort of switching gears a little bit, but what are some of your thoughts on using art in terms of social justice? Is it effective, or if you have suggestions of ways, do you think it's a good way in terms of, especially when dealing with these raw emotions that some people might feel?
I think, one of the things that I think about is learning for students. It takes three different forms, basically. One is it's cognitive, that is what we know, behavior, or what we do, and affective, that is our motivation, our heart, in a sense, right? And we often spend a lot of time on the cognitive, you learn certain dates and certain people, the behavior, what you do, but the affective is often kind of the deeper emotional side of people that come out. I think using the arts, be they performing arts, be they the visual arts, are really great ways of pulling from students affective abilities, that is their motivation, their feeling of something. You can look at a piece of artwork and say, I feel for that artist, or I feel for the person that artist is depicting, or I feel for the situation that is represented in the artwork, right? And I think that those are really effective ways of getting students who may not do well in other ways. I mean, students learn, and we always think about student learning, and some students are not cognitive learners or behavioral learners, and some of them are affective learners, that is, they learn from their emotions. So I think art can be really used well there. And it's not just using other people's arts, but giving students the ability to create their own artwork, right? Getting students to be able to design their own things. I have an exercise I'm running this weekend, for instance, on Saturday. I'm running a diversity leadership workshop. I live in the city of Rockville, Maryland, and I used to be the chairman of the Human Rights Commission, but I started doing this 3 years ago. So I run this workshop, and part of it is that in the workshop, students have to create an artwork that represents themselves, and they have to do something. I give them a paper plate. It's very easy. And I say, I want you to draw a symbol, draw a piece of artwork that talks about your identity and who you are, and then I want you to speak through that artwork and kind of describing us through what it is that you've created. And I think you can really get some interesting insights for students who don't communicate in other ways as well.
Interesting. So I have, let's see, I have a few questions here. I'm trying to let them come in order. But so one of the questions here, which I think is really interesting, is, so for instance, like in Ferguson, and there's been others, at least in recent history, these movements of trying to create social change, but after a short period of time, they sort of fizzle out. And so, how do we keep these movements alive, to keep the dialogue open? And because I feel like, especially in the U.S., in more recent times, we're really quite bad at movements and sustaining them.
We have a very short attention span in this country, right? And, if it doesn't make it in the CBS Evening News or the NewsHour or the front page of the Washington Post, we're on to the next thing. And we have so many things that are kind of put out there that we have to, those of us, obviously everybody's on the line, we're engaged in public affairs, so we're trying to follow everything and we have to prioritize. I think the classic example is the Occupy movement that, was organic, was all around the United States, international. There was a large period of time when this property was occupied in New York City, and now nobody hears anything from it, and we wonder what came from it, right, I think, I don't have an answer to that, to be quite frank with you. I have friends now who are working on the ground in Ferguson doing some very important work, and one of the things that they recognize is that many of the social injustice problems we have are not even remedied by people's change in behavior. They're remedied by changing the structure in which we operate. That is, changing the way our legal system works or changing the way our education system works. So it's a long time to undo structures in society to create more opportunity. It's not just a matter of saying we are a more tolerant, more accepting society, as much as undoing things that may have been set up 30, 40, 50 years ago. Yeah. So people have to be in it for the long haul. So for instance, we think about social injustice in the Occupy movement. One of the things that I would argue is that the impact or the outcomes of that may have been legislation that creates more accountability, or may have been ways of access to certain opportunities that didn't exist beforehand. Often we don't know those things are happening because they're not front and center. They're kind of behind the scenes. So one of the things I would say is that there probably is more that came from it that we recognize. But also we have to recognize that we're not into quick fixes because some of the issues we're dealing with are very deep. So we have to build a coalition, build the support. And then one of the challenges for people who do social justice and activist work generally is what I would call crossing the Rubicon between what they do and the policymakers. There are many people who work on these issues that are very well-meaning, well-intended, but they are not able to get the policymakers, the people that we elect to Congress and legislators and so forth, to engage. That's ultimately the key to all of this. So that's what I think people are trying to do in Ferguson. My colleagues that I know are working there are not only trying to raise awareness, they're trying to get people in the community who are members of the legislature and the city council to change the way they're doing things. Then change can be made.
So that's sort of the chicken and the egg kind of thought is, do you, and I understand what you're saying, so is it easier for, so there's social change, but there's also cultural change, right? You have to change the mentality of how people view things. So is it more effective if it comes sort of top down, or sort of the grassroots of the community rising up and voicing their concerns and making our justice system change their ways, or whatever system it is that they're trying to change? Or is it easier to go to the system and have them change and then trickle down?
One of the things that I would say is actually the elites in society and the people that would represent the masses, actually neither one of them are actually the better place. There's often a middle coalition of community leaders. Leadership is really important. Right. Religious leaders, academic leaders that can make the change. Because those people actually have relationships with both the political and economic elites and, we would say, the larger masses. But I would say a lot of the change happens on the inside. And so you have to get people on the inside to make change. You know, people argue about, you know, reforms that need to happen in Wall Street, or reforms that need to happen in our military, or in whatever industry it is. And so people are on the outside clamoring for it. But really what you have to do is you have to get people on the inside to recognize that change has to be made, and those people in the inside to take that on as something that they want to do. Often, it may not be in the same way people on the outside would like it, because people have to make compromises. So I'll give you an example. Something called corporate social responsibility is a big theme in many corporations today. And people who often are in social justice think that it's really lip service, or it's really still trying to achieve the bottom line. That is, you're still trying to make a dollar, you know, on corporate social responsibility. But there are many companies that take it very seriously. That is, you know, if we're going to work in a part of the world, we're going to make sure that human rights abuses we're not committing human rights abuses, we're doing the right thing. And that comes from educating people on the inside to take this on, because in many respects, corporate people who own stock in those companies expect it. So we have to expect social justice from corporations and businesses, for businesses on the inside, for them to make the change.
Yeah, that's a great example of.
And that's not easy, but corporate social responsibility is a good example. And I think it's moving in the right direction, but it's still something that is hard to deal with for some people.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I have one last question for one of our participants. And since this is about World Day of Justice, what do you think the impact of the day is? And, are there any ways for people to get involved and, to celebrate this day, or to be active and engaged?
Well, I think there are two things that we can do. If we're thinking about ourselves as Americans, we have to recognize that our American identity is just one of our identities, that we're also members of a global community. And we have to recognize that a social injustice in Syria or Pakistan or any part of the world is our social injustice also that we have to deal with. So one of the things about social justice is showing to students and for us to acknowledge that we are part of a greater community and we have an obligation there. Now, how we act upon that obligation is going to vary. For some people, they feel it's philanthropic, they donate. For some people, it may be making connections in their own community. So for instance, what happens in your local community often is a mirror of what happens in a greater community. We have many communities where we have large refugee populations. All of these refugee populations are coming from parts of the world that have been mired in brutality and human rights abuses.
Right.
So one of the things we might do is, we're not all going to travel to a part of the world to make a difference, but can we reach out to the communities that are different than we are, that often are coming from those parts of the world, and create links to them and provide them with opportunities? And that way we're helping to alleviate their social injustice, and in some respects maybe even helping people in that other part of the world. So I really think it has to be on a personal level, and a part of it is for us to kind of recognize who's in our community and doing it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent way to sort of end that of, taking the time, as this day is approaching and looking at ways that we can connect with others, I think is very important, and to expand the dialogue. Before we close out, do you have any final words, or do you want to share your blog or anything like that with us?
So I can be reached at www.davidjsmithconsulting.com, and actually everyone has your connection.
Right, yeah.
Send people to them. I do have a couple of videos that I would like to have shown, and if you send me an email, my email is davidjsmith@davidjsmithconsulting.com. I know that's kind of long, but I can give that to you. I have a blog that I write about social justice, community colleges, but really education generally, peace education, and that's also at that website, and I can give people that URL also if they want to go to that website and find out the work that I do. And I'm glad that you all took up some time this afternoon. I know that looks like a lot of educators. I'm hoping that maybe there were a few students on the line also. And I wish everybody the best. I'm glad that you're taking this time out and connecting. We do a lot of great things at the World Affairs Council, DC, and this is just one of the many things that we do. Keep connecting with us.
Well, thank you so much, David. And yes, if anyone has any questions or wants information, please email us, and we'll be happy to connect you and get you everything that you need. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope everyone stays warm and dry.